Hello, and welcome to Based on Facts, where fiction and superstition meet logic and scientific facts. On 95.7 FM, WELT, broadcasting from the Allen County Public Library. My name is Chris Rex, this is my wife Uriah, and today we will be discussing
the Harambe controversy.
So essentially we're talking about this event that's permeated a lot of our local news lately.
All of it. Essentially.
Perhaps all of it. Where basically this gorilla was shot and killed after a 3-4-year-old child named Isaiah fell into the exhibit and then was subsequently dragged around by this gorilla.
And this was at the Cincinnati Zoo?
Yes. So this basically this whole thing occurred at the Gorilla World exhibit at the Cincinnati Zoo. And since that point in time, on Saturday, May 28th, around 4 p.m., since that time the exhibit has been closed, at least until further notice. Just while the zoo itself tries to reevaluate some things, and tries to figure out how or why this whole thing happened, and perhaps how they can avoid such things happening in the future. So what's kind of interesting about this whole scenario is how a boy of such a young age managed to get himself into the gorilla enclosure in the first place. And so what's just the general gist of the situation is that the boy somehow navigated through the fencing or the barriers that were in place at the time, went through some bushes, and then managed to fall into the moat that was surrounding the primary area of the gorilla enclosure.
And you can go online and do your best to find some images of the actual enclosure. You'll see a lot of times zoos are converting their enclosures to be more than just a cage or an area with a big mesh fence. They're becoming more like a natural habitat. And so this enclosure, if you look at it, you see a very typical, you walk in through this nice little bamboo hut into the enclosure, and what you see is a nice fence. And when I say nice, I mean a not so nice fence. But you see a fence with a little information plaque in front, and then there's about 4 feet of bushes and cliff in front of that fence, and then a 15-foot drop. It's not an incline, it is a drop. These enclosures have to meet a national standard for safety, and every zoo has to go under code and inspections regularly to make sure everything is up to par. These are strenuous, very strict codes because obviously safety is at stake. So just visually, this is quite a drop, making anybody want to think twice about leaping over into a 15-foot chasm into water. But the thing about this incident is that this fence wasn't a very good fence in my opinion. Yes, there was 4 feet in front of it and a drop, but this fence was posts, like so, with maybe 1, 2, or 3 little steel wires in between it. They're not thick wires, they're just little, you could easily stick your arm, your body, an adult human could crawl in between these little wires. It was more of a standard, here's the fence, don't go any further else you're going to fall into a big chasm. The chasm, it seems, was more the barrier from, them and the gorilla. So that's the kind of setup this enclosure has.
Right, and that did take us quite a bit of delving into just to find out that mere fact of what kind of fencing they had at the exact area where the child fell. Because typically when we were looking up images, we were seeing these like giant bamboo planks that were very tightly spaced. Right, so we were sitting there wondering, how could a child possibly have navigated that or climbed over that? And then we found one image, a simple image, is a very low quality, low resolution image that showed exactly what she just described, to where there were wires that were spaced probably around 8 inches.
Flexible wires.
And yeah, it's flexible. So definitely if a toddler wants to crawl through that or under that, they definitely can. And we start to imagine how this scenario becomes possible. Because otherwise we're talking about bamboo planks, or even in some cases I saw they actually had like chain link fence, which of course is highly difficult to navigate unless you just climb over the thing. So we start to imagine it being possible that this can happen. and even more possible once we consider, the whole issue of whether the toddler was under direct supervision at the time. And so that'll get to another point that we'll cover here later. But the gist of the story, overall gist of the story, yes, the child navigated through this fencing, navigated that 4 feet or so between the fencing and the cliff wall, and then tumbled over the wall. Because as many of you know, children, especially of that age, are not the most aware of gravity yet, and aren't necessarily the most well-balanced creatures in the world. So he tumbled over the cliff and into the enclosure. Now, if he had tumbled 15 feet onto straight up concrete, his chances for survival would have been much more slim. The fortunate thing is that he actually tumbled into a foot of water in the moat that was surrounding the Gorilla World enclosure. As such, that kind of helped cushion his fall, especially since he's a very light organism. Being a 3-year-old toddler, he was probably under 40 pounds. So he probably didn't take much damage from the fall, just because he was cushioned by the water. As such, he was actually pretty intact once he got down there, and that's where the issue started to begin. Originally, there were 3 gorillas in that enclosure, in that particular exhibit, 2 females and 1 male. Very shortly after the toddler fell into the enclosure, some of the zoo staff, some of the keepers, came around and tried to summon the gorillas back off the exhibit. And fortunately, the 2 female gorillas responded to this call and went off the exhibit. Unfortunately, the 3rd gorilla did not. The 3rd gorilla was a male western lowland gorilla by the name of Harambe, or Haram. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that.
We're going off Harambe, that's how the media is pronouncing it, but we know how well they get things right.
But anyway, this guy, he was a very large individual, probably around 450 pounds. He was 17 years old. He had just turned that the previous day. So, this is the day after his birthday. He should be feeling pretty good by that point.
How old do gorillas normally live?
That's a very good question. Last time I knew anything about gorillas, I was thinking their lifespan was about half of ours on average. So I would estimate 40 years.
Okay, so this isn't an old, docile gorilla. This is a very, mid-aged gorilla.
But then again, I'm not a primatologist, so don't take me for granted on that. But that was my understanding of gorillas, is that honestly, we as humans are very, very similar to them in many ways. So they can also reach some pretty incredible ages. Now, this guy is a member of a species that is critically endangered. Okay, there are only about 175,000 of these guys left in the world. They're definitely suffering decreases every day in population. The good news is that honestly, they're one of the species that are faring better in comparison to other species. There are a lot of ape-type species that are not doing so well as the lowland gorilla. But these guys are actually doing pretty well, because 175,000, that's not great, but it's also not terrible.
It's a growing number thanks to zoos.
We have a number of animals in the world that are limited to the hundreds in the wild. Okay, so these guys are actually doing pretty well overall in population, comparatively speaking to the other critically endangered species.
Like Sumatran and Bengal tigers.
Right.
There are only about 347 last time I checked.
Yeah.
And that's not good.
So that's really super critically endangered in those cases. But this particular zoo, Cincinnati Zoo, they actually have 9 of these types of gorillas, or 9 individuals of this one species of gorilla in their zoo. And so Harambe was just another one. And when we go to try to figure out exactly what happened during this whole scenario, we start to hear various reports, of exactly the sequence of events that played out and the exact events that did happen. And so we hear some reports by people like the Cincinnati Fire Department Chief, Mark Monahan, who states that the gorilla was violently dragging and throwing the child. Now, if you look up the video, because apparently there was only one video shot of this event, which is kind of hard for me to believe.
Yeah.
Especially with so many people's cell phones and the fact that this event took place over 10 minutes. Kind of hard for me to believe that there was only one video shot. But needless to say, by watching that one video myself, I didn't necessarily see a whole lot of throwing the child.
Yeah.
I definitely saw dragging. Okay. And I was dragging through water.
And this gorilla was moving pretty fast. He had the child by the leg, and he started just to charge through the water back and forth. And the child was being drugged behind. That's pretty scary, and that can lead to major head trauma and very severe injuries because the gorilla is huge and strong.
Right.
So that is big life-threatening issue right there.
Right. And we understand that. Now some of the bits of footage, you can hear the mother in the background actually saying something like, "Isaiah, be calm. Mommy's right here. Mommy loves you." Okay, which is great. I love that the mother is trying to be proactive in the situation and trying to calm the child down, keep it from screaming and freaking out and crying, because that's very, very important, of paramount importance when we come to tragedies like this.
Which the child did remain calm. I was very impressed.
And that was part of the surprising part, is that honestly, for the most part, the child behaved. The issue that we come to, that we'll talk a little bit more about here later, is that the crowd did not behave quite so well.
No.
And so we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, the zoo's dangerous animal response team was able to come on site about 10 minutes after this whole event started, and they made the decision at that point to resort to a long rifle to actually shoot and kill Harambe. And this comes to another issue just because they were concerned that the tranquilizer darts would take too much time, and would thus leave the child in more imminent danger. And this whole notion was kind of reinforced by the zoo director, actually, Thane Maynard, who said that the zoo's in the business of taking care of endangered animals, and we don't want to be in the situation where we have to kill them. But all sorts of things happen in a situation like that, so I believe that we made the right choice.
On top of that, Jack Hanna also endorsed this, and he's also big zoo director, endorser, all that good stuff. He said the same thing.
Right. And he goes on to say that tranquilizing the 450-pound gorilla was not an option because of this fact that they take several minutes to work, and that the child was in imminent danger, and we needed to try to preserve that child's life as much as possible, basically. He also brought up the point that just the mere act of using a tranquilizer dart on an animal can sometimes irritate the animal and cause it to do hostile or aggressive acts that it wouldn't normally do, because now it's actually being hurt. And so it may have taken out some of that hostility and aggression on the child and further imperiled that child's life. And so but he goes on to clarify that the child was not under attack. Okay, and this is a notion that a number of people don't necessarily understand, because if that child was under attack, it would have already been killed. All right?
Instantly.
It does not take much for a 450-pound organism of any kind to kill something that weighs 30 pounds. Okay, doesn't take much for that to happen. So as such, he understands, the zoo director at the Cincinnati Zoo, he understands that the child was at risk, but we clearly know that it wasn't being attacked. Because in 10 minutes of being attacked, not even a full-grown adult would survive that gorilla.
Yeah.
Sad enough to say, because it's been estimated by some people that those gorillas can have strength that is about 10 times our own strength, okay,
Yeah.
which is phenomenal for us to think about. But
You think how strong The Rock or Vin Diesel would be, and you just combine 10 of those big monstrous dudes into a gorilla.
yeah,
Pure muscle.
It's ridiculous. But anyway, so we see this kind of situation where the zoo director seems to think that the the gorilla wasn't attacking the child. But some of these other reports, for instance, from the fire department, that was saying that the gorilla was, throwing the child and being very aggressive towards it, doesn't seem to have been the case.
There was one report that said that the gorilla threw the child 10 feet in the air and the child landed on the gorilla's back. And you see the video, and that's clearly not what happened. I don't understand why someone would say something like this if they're trying to get their spotlight on the news or what was going on. But I think there was only one case of somebody trying to say the gorilla threw the child in the air to the point where it landed on the gorilla's back. I thought that was ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't know. We've heard so many different things swirling around the internet lately, just that it's getting to be ridiculous. And that's why we felt kind of compelled to go ahead and do this episode, just to help inform people about some of the facts behind this whole situation. Because there's just so much rumors and crap spreading around that it's very, very difficult to tease out what exactly happened and how these things happened.
So pretty much by video evidence and testimony from zookeepers and fire rescue and anything that is solid evidence provable says that the child fell into the enclosure and the gorilla at first stood over the child, not crushing him, just stood over, which made people think the gorilla was protecting him or standing guard. But once the crowd started yelling and getting a little out of control, that is when the gorilla, after the gorilla pulled up the kid's pants, again people thinking it was caring and protective, that's when the gorilla grabbed the child and started dragging it around the enclosure at high speeds. That is all that was specifically outlined. That is all the facts. There was no throwing, period. Just there was a small period of guarding and then the dragging and the thrashing.
So part of the problem is that we only have 2.5 minutes of video of the 10-minute incident. Okay, so we're only seeing a fourth of what's actually going on. And that really frustrates me, especially when I go to try to make an episode based on facts, in that we only have a quarter of the facts, essentially. And the rest of it has to rely on pictures or hearsay. Mm-hmm. And it's just, it's frustrating, so to speak. And if we look at the past history of Gorilla World, okay, because obviously the first question is, were proper protocols followed on the part of the zoo to try to prevent a tragedy like this from happening? And the answer is yes. Gorilla World has been in existence for the past 38 years, and they have never had an incident there at the Cincinnati Zoo.
38 years is a pretty good record.
Yeah, and they have always been shown to be in compliance with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, as well as the USDA. So it's interesting to sit here and think, well, if the zoo wasn't technically doing anything wrong, was somebody doing something wrong? And that's the question that people are being left with. That's why you see a lot more of this kind of backlash movement against the parents rather than against the zoo, because the zoo is in complete compliance with all the protocols that were already set in place. Okay, and even though before that fencing with the 3 wires that were spread about 8 inches apart, although we may see that as a danger, technically that association approved it. Okay, so they thought that that's a pretty good way to keep people from walking onto the exhibit and joining the gorillas. It's just nobody had considered the possibility of an unsupervised toddler crawling through those barricades.
And then dropping down 15 foot. It'd be different if there was just a tiny fence between you and a gorilla. That's not the case. There is a huge 15 foot by what looks to be like an 8 foot long by 15 foot chasm. Enough that a gorilla can't swing over or climb up. That's a pretty good feat to be monkey proof.
Yeah. And, so we're left with the situation that, they have to start looking at their own safety protocols and maybe ramping them up to better accommodate for crawling toddlers that are unsupervised and going through these barricades. It's just not something people normally think about. Now, what's interesting is that we're seeing some of these witness reports that indicate that the child actually wanted to go into the exhibit. Okay, we have a witness here that said that the boy recalled that they heard the boy wanting to go into the water, and so he was asking his mommy, he's like, hey, can I go into the water, basically the moat, essentially. Hey, can I go into the moat? And the mommy's like, no. Obviously, being a good parent. But apparently that toddler was really bent on getting into the moat, and so apparently he went off and did this.
Now, I'm not saying this is an example of bad parenting, of a child not listening to mommy and going and doing it anyway. We as adults still do that. That is not a sign of negligence or bad parenting. But it is a sign that this toddler can talk full sentences and can ask mommy for something and mom says no. And has the cognitive presence to still go off and do something. So this isn't a, 2-year-old or 3-year-old. This is more closer to a 4-year-old, almost starting kindergarten. So there is quite a level of activity and capability there. And you really should pay close attention to somebody like this, because they can wander off and do something.
And as a consequence, we heard that the gorilla was shot and killed, but the boy was then taken to a hospital, admitted for a few hours, and then released. So clearly he didn't have the most serious of injuries. They definitely weren't life-threatening by any means.
So what was reported is that he had a lot of bruising, a lot of scratches, and he did have a concussion.
Right.
But there were no strains, there were no fractures, there were no broken bones, just some pretty traumatic scaring. I mean, this kid is going to be a little freaked out for a while, I will say. But besides that, that's it. The kid was okay. He remained calm.
Yep.
And the gorilla obviously didn't try and attack him. That needs to be very clear. This gorilla was not attacking the child. We'll reference what an experienced gorilla zookeeper and a primate expert has to say on the behavior of what the gorilla was actually doing.
Later on.
Yes.
For now, let's move on to what the mother was saying. Some of her Facebook posts and such, as well as some of the things that she did on site. Now, already we mentioned that she was very good at trying to keep the child calm once it fell into the enclosure, saying, please be calm, mother loves you, things of that nature. But additionally, she shouted some other things, which I thought were kind of bizarre, just from my perspective, where she said, where she would shout, please protect him, God, please protect him. I always find that interesting when people when people shout things like that, just from my perspective in being an atheist. It's always fascinating to me that people will call upon God in certain situations in which God should have been able to prevent in the first place. But I digress. So I found that kind of interesting that she was shouting that. It was also kind of interesting to hear that she was watching a lot of different children at that time. Now, whether all those children were hers or whether she was watching some other people's children, I'm not sure. The reports aren't clear about that. But it was clear that her attention was definitely divided between a number of individuals that were in her care, and that her attention was distracted from this particular toddler at a time in which that toddler was able to take advantage of and then crawl into the enclosure.
Which, personally, after being asked, can I go play in the gorilla enclosure, that would, enable me to want to pay just a little bit more attention, knowing that there is a desire there.
Right, right. And that's the thing, is that when we see that initial event happening, we should definitely put on an extra layer of guard or protection against such an event from happening.
And I also want to point out that it was great that the mother seemed to be in more of a calm manner, telling her child, stay calm, stay calm. But if she's shouting, God protect him, it's kind of hard to hear the volume in the video, but I would really hope that she wasn't shouting this at the top of her lungs and adding to the problem of the crowd being loud and out of control and intimidating the gorilla, which would in turn have him respond in an intimidation dance. So I hope that this shouting wasn't not only unhelpful and kind of useless, but also causing the problem.
Yeah. Now, if we go to Facebook and lock onto that directly
Gotta love
in relation
Facebook.
to the mother, she actually did make a few posts here, just kind of commenting on the situation. So if we look at Michelle Gregg's Facebook, we can see that she posts, "For those of you that have seen the news or been on social media, that was my son that fell in the gorilla exhibit at the zoo. God protected my child until the authorities were able to get to him. My son is safe and was able to walk away with a concussion and a few scrapes. No broken bones or internal injuries. As a society, we are quick to judge how a parent could take their eyes off of a child, and if anyone knows me, I keep a tight watch on my kids." Let's just pause.
I hear this a lot.
Yes.
I hear this a lot from parents.
Every single time that something happens to their kids, a parent will sit there and say, "I keep a tight watch on my kids." It's like, well, if you did, that shouldn't have happened, shouldn't have? That seems to contradict what happened.
And we're probably going to get a lot of fire
Yeah.
for this when people say, accidents happen,
Right.
you can't have complete control, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. I would say that had this kid been on one of those little leash backpacks and it still happened, then I would call that quite a ridiculous freak accident. And I would be more sympathetic to the mom if she had multiple children with her, some of them which were wandering around. I would encourage one having tether. And those little backpacks are not shameful, as some parents might say. If you're going to a zoo, a kid kind of wants a monkey on their back. It's normal. And a lot of those leashes have little pouches and zippers to help parents carry their kids' stuff. That is a great idea. Instead of having a backpack, have a little monkey with a little tail that's attached to you for small children. And, it's probably demeaning to a 13-year-old, but not to a 5-year-old, 4-year-old, 3-year-old, who you want to have a little bit of leeway if you have even smaller infant in your arms. That is taking every measure to take care and supervise your kid if you have multiple children under your care. That is good parenting, that is non-negligent, that is taking steps to prevent what could possibly happen. She didn't do that.
Right.
A lot of parents don't.
So, that goes into a whole nother issue entirely.
Yeah.
that we'll get to here in a second. We'll explore that a little bit more. But she goes on to say in her Facebook post that accidents happen, but I am thankful for the right people being in the right place today. I want to thank everyone for their thoughts and prayers. What started off as a wonderful day turned into a scary one. Okay. She goes on to say in another post, "We are so thankful to the Lord that our child is safe. He is home and doing just fine. We extend our heartfelt thanks for the quick action by the Cincinnati Zoo staff. We know that this was a very difficult decision for them, and that they are grieving for the loss of their gorilla. We hope that you will respect our privacy at this time."
Now, I have to say, both of those posts were very nice. They were not hateful. They were not anything ridiculous. So
They were respectful.
I give her props for that. Just trying to be diplomatic about the situation. Good for her.
Right. And the thing that obviously bothers me is just constantly bringing up God and the Lord into things, because the Lord wasn't the one who shot and killed the gorilla. It was the zoo staff. But going beyond that, we can start to think about how certain other people that were once again nearby might have influenced this situation. So we can look at a mother that was nearby who actually kind of saw this event happening and tried to prevent it. She said that she tried to grab him, but she just couldn't get to him fast enough as his toddler was navigating through the fence and getting away from the mother. And, she said that once she saw the kid fall into the enclosure and the gorilla start interacting with the kid, she didn't perceive that the gorilla was violently throwing the child around. She definitely saw him dragging the child, but she didn't see him being thrown around as the fire department was trying to indicate, and a number of other people were trying to indicate.
Now, let's break that down. The gorilla was not throwing this kid in the air like a lasso, but as the video shows, there was excessive dragging. I wouldn't say it was violent, but because the gorilla, again, was not attacking the kid, but when a gorilla is charging, that's really fast and dragging a kid, life-threatening right there. So again, not exactly violent, but aggressive. Aggressive is a good word for this situation.
And we'll get to breaking that down here later as well. But what's interesting is that this one particular witness was able to get a picture of the gorilla standing over the child just moments before the gorilla was shot. And that seems to indicate to me that if the gorilla was just standing there next to the child, that it wasn't necessarily being aggressive directly towards the child. Once again, otherwise it wouldn't have even lasted. Additionally, we can look at some other people's testimonies who actually observed the mother of the toddler in this particular situation, who was calling out for her son shortly after the toddler disappeared. And she basically turns to the people around her and she's like, "Hey, has anyone seen my son?" And people are like, "Well, we saw a boy crawl through the bushes there. He had green shorts on." And she's like, "Oh no." And so sure enough, it was her child that had crawled away and fallen into the enclosure. Now, interestingly enough, we did see some efforts by the crowd, so to speak, to try to remedy this situation. We did have a husband of this particular bystander want to go into the enclosure to try to capture the child and protect it from the gorilla. But the wife told him no, essentially.
That would have been a bad idea.
Right. So through all this, that bystander that witnessed this thing go down, she insists that the mother wasn't at fault, and that she wasn't negligent, and that the zoo did a great job of handling this whole situation, especially since nothing like this had ever happened before. So when we try to evaluate exactly how this whole situation happened and what kind of parenting advice can be given from it, so to speak, we see that we come to a fine line between parenting too much and parenting too little. Some people will sit here and claim, well, we get a lot of flack for being a helicopter parent and taking too much interest in our child's lives, in particular, namely in the teenage years and such, when parents are just looking over the shoulder of their young and playing a little too much of a role in their lives, especially more than they would like to at that particular time.
Yeah.
And then we see the other end of the spectrum, where we have parents that are just off doing their own thing and letting their child do their own thing. And we see a very hands-off kind of approach being utilized there. And so it's difficult sometimes for a parent to determine where on that spectrum they should be. Should they be very hands-on or should they be very hands-off? And that's a great question. And what we see is that, generally speaking, it's great to have kind of a spectrum that's respective of the age of that child. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the younger the child, the more hands-on you need to be. That's why we have kindergarten at around 6 years old, because at 6 years old, that's where the child is starting to be able to be very responsible for themselves and to start to learn these basic societal norms, like, hey, there's a fence, don't cross it.
Hold hands when you're walking across the street. Don't throw food. Hitting is bad. Just very basic, good, and bad behavior.
And so as we see kids starting to pick up on these things and learn these qualities themselves, as far as how to function as an adult in society, that's when parents can start letting go as they gradually grow older, up until the point where the child becomes a teenager. And really, the parents should be very, very hands-off in most ways.
In most cases, but obviously teenagers can be unpredictable because that's when a lot of outside influence comes in. So sometimes you might have to be a little bit more hands-on as a teenager. Sometimes you can be more hands-off. I think that's really, really iffy.
But the thing is that we see this general trend where you have very young kids requiring a lot of attention all the time because they are very unpredictable, they are very untrained, and they're not very responsible personally. And so we definitely require a lot more parenting for the younger kids than we do for the older kids. As such, we can't rely on younger kids to be responsible and do things that we would consider to be logical and common sense. Like, don't cross that barrier. It has a fence, and even though it's only 3 wires, we as adults, we understand, oh, okay, we're not supposed to cross that fence. But a toddler is like, well, heck, I can crawl through that. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
And so they go ahead and do it, And so we would expect a bit higher level of parenting, a more hands-on approach when it comes to younger kids that don't quite understand that yet. And so that's kind of one of the issues that we're trying to get at here, is that a lot of people are starting to question this notion, whether enough parenting was involved in this situation or not. Because we have some people wanting to emphasize empathy for the parents, for the mom and the dad of this toddler, as opposed to trying to blame them because they see that, well, you know what, having children, accidents happen. And I agree, and I've seen it myself. I don't have kids myself, but I have nieces, and certainly they get into their own sets of trouble all on their own.
We have been in situations where we are supervising our
Right.
nieces. I have nephews, and so we do know what it's like to have that pressure on us to make sure, hey, you're watching our kids. Don't let anything happen to them. We understand that pressure. We might not be parents, but please don't try and say that we don't know how it feels. We don't know what it's really like. I'm sorry, if you're caring for any other human being, even if it's another person's child, that almost makes it worse because you will be to blame for the consequences of your actions.
Yep.
You don't have any excuse of, well, I was home cooking, oh, I had another kid. It's all on you, and you will be crucified if anything happens to that child. So it's almost like the pressure is a little more. So we get it.
And that's an awesome point.
Yeah.
I actually never thought about that before. We definitely put a lot higher level of blame on babysitters than we do actual parents, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, because apparently parents can use any excuse that they can come up with legitimately and get away with murder, essentially.
I wouldn't go that far, but parents, they have a lot on their mind.
Right.
Having kids is a lot to handle. Right. And I get that. And even though a babysitter is only with this kid for a certain amount of time, during that time, that babysitter has his complete attention on this child. And you would expect that's how being a parent would be, wouldn't it? Because if anything happens, that babysitter, there's no excuse. There's never an excuse. Your job was to watch my kid. Well, what's your job all the time?
Yeah.
So just a funny little point there.
No, that's great, because babysitters are expected to be flawless. And if they're not flawless, then guess what? People move on to another babysitter.
And this woman, this was her own son, but she was other children were these other people's children, and is that why she was taking a little bit more care with them? Something to consider. I'm not sitting here saying, oh, she was negligible. I'm not sitting here saying that it was wrong, it was right. We'll get to that later, to our personal opinions, but just funny point there.
Yeah, because if she was indeed watching other people's children, then that would give her more responsibility that she feels that she needs to give to those other children than her own children. So that's kind of interesting. Now, some people see this as an example of why we need to have leashes on our children. Going back to what you were saying with the whole backpack leash situation. Because had such an implement been used in this particular case, we would not be seeing the child going anywhere further than, 5 feet from the mom?
When you go to a zoo with a large group, if it's just families, mom, dad, maybe 2 or 3 kids, it's a little easier to spread the parenting out. Or if, you've got trips, like school trips and things like that. It is very common for schools to bring an entire high school, middle school, elementary school to a zoo. That's crazy. That's so many kids. You know what they do? It's about 4 kids, or whatever the actual state ratio is, amount of 4 kids to one supervisor teacher person. And yeah, it's very, very small, and even that is a little crazy. But yeah, it's very possible to have proper supervision. One person should not be taking care of, more than 3 kids at a time. That's a little intense.
But that's the thing, is that when you're talking about elementary school trips, when you're talking about middle school or high school trips, we're talking about people that have responsibility. We're not talking about a 3 or 4-year-old child that hasn't learned responsibility yet because they're barely cognitive and functional in the first place.
It's true, but I'm just saying, you're putting yourself in a situation, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of risk. You are going into this situation where your defenses are up because anything can happen. And so even with young elementary students, they have a lot of supervisors per a number of students. There are buddy systems. You don't leave, you don't go anywhere without anybody. There's a whole list of rules. Don't do this. They have a game plan. I think parents need to really implement that with their own children whenever doing something like this. This is crazy going into a zoo. If you really think about it, you're going into an area with a bunch of creatures that could easily kill you should they be prompted to by their animal instincts. Should they be in a position where they feel threatened and they respond that way. So and you're with a whole ton of people, so even if the kid didn't even fall in a gorilla enclosure, what could have happened? There are human predators out there that could have nabbed that kid up. You never know.
Yep. Just to go further along those lines, I just see that when children are within the range of danger, which is to say within a few feet of danger.
A 15-foot cliff.
Or road, even. We can see where we would have an acute level of attention given to kids when they're so close to other obstacles that can kill them. Whether it be, like I said, being next to a road or being within 4 feet of a 15-foot cliff. Those are kind of important things to keep in mind. And so that's why a lot of people are trying to cry out that this mother be charged with some sort of negligence. They're seeing that there seems to be some sort of point at which she stopped paying attention to the child, which permitted the child to go over that cliff. Especially since it took her a little while to catch on to this and having to ask the people around her. And so that brings up the question, whether or not we should even have sympathy for the mother. Because if she was the one at fault, well, it's kind of hard to sympathize for people who, made their own bed, essentially. And so this has brought up some other very negative comments from people online. There's this person that said, oh, well, they should have shot the mother instead of the gorilla.
Yeah,
that's a bit extreme. You don't have to go that far. But you know what? There is this petition on change.org. And as I just checked it a couple hours ago, there was 476,000 signatures on this petition out of the 500,000 that needed. And this petition is basically to try to press charges against the parents for being negligent in this scenario. Trying to call in basically a Department of Child Services and trying to evaluate the home situation of this family. I think that's
really extreme.
Maybe a little excessive.
Not a little. That's really, really excessive.
But needless to say, there's this movement towards that end.
So to kind of sum up, we've looked at the enclosure. We've looked at the real possibility of how it could have happened. We looked at what the mother did and did not do. We looked at what the crowd did and did not do. Now we looked at exactly what happened that the gorilla was doing with the kid in the enclosure. Now we're going to get into a little bit of what the gorilla was actually doing, and then we can move on to figuring out, was it right to use a long rifle or should a tranq have been used? And we've been talking a lot about what people have been saying on the internet. Well, we need to go to the experts and not, I'm not saying that zookeepers aren't experts. They are. They're the ones who work with these creatures in a captivity, and then there are people who make a whole life of studying them. If I go to a zoo, to a reptile exhibit, then I think the people who care for the animals are experts. But then you have somebody like him who is far beyond an expert. Someone like him who actually makes an entire life's work of studying said reptiles, particular snakes for him. That is, I would call a specialist. That is a level beyond experts. And so we have got two things. The first one is from a woman named Amanda. She made a post on Facebook, which, funny enough, it was deleted really soon after, but somebody republished it as an article, and she makes a lot of great points.
Yeah, so this lady, she had been a zookeeper for 2.5 years. During that time, she had worked with gorillas.
Yeah, directly with them. She's been a lot of attention on the gorillas.
Right, and that was her favorite animal, which is great. She made this post on Facebook that ended up being shared 1.2 million times at this particular point in time. And she made some comments. She had a very nice lengthy post that was very detailed. And she gave some of her insight from her experience in working with these animals very intimately at the zoo. And she made some comments about the gorilla and how he seemed to be behaving just based on what she saw on the video. And she saw that the gorilla's posture and maybe even some of his facial expressions, most in particular his tight lips, kind of indicated that he was agitated, which, funny enough, I concur with.
Yeah.
He definitely seemed agitated, and she comments that he was standing very tense on his knuckles, kind of over the child more often than not, essentially bracing himself to intimidate whatever is coming at him. As such, she doesn't necessarily think he was protecting the boy, but instead trying to use him as a tool for intimidating whatever was threatening him, which happened to be the crowd, funny enough. And she has seen these gorillas in particular use large objects, branches and such, to slam and drag around the enclosure in order to try to do this intimidation display by creating a lot of noise.
A lot of noise, big visual effects.
Right,
it's what they do to say, don't mess with me. You know, it pretty much the essence of a person saying, I got a big gun, don't mess with me. A gorilla will take a big branch and wave it around and smash it.
Right. And that's what we typically think about, just stereotypically when you think about gorillas. We think about them, waving their arms in the air and doing
beating
these
their
big,
chest.
and beating their chest. So both those things create a lot of visual stimulus as well as auditory stimulus to try to intimidate anything that might want to harm them, so to speak. And that's what she perceives this particular gorilla to be doing at the time.
So I guess the crowd coming in and converging, and if you see the videos, there is a lot of people pressed up against this fence trying to see what's going on. There's probably pictures being taken, phone noises, they're yelling, they're screaming. When the gorilla starts dragging the kid, there's multiple women just screaming at the top of their heads, and I get that. Personally, I'm a woman, I don't scream if I see something scary. I rarely scream if something scary is coming at me. So I don't understand the I'm going to scream response. I just don't get that. But yeah, the child fell, and in the video you first see the gorilla walk up to it and, pull the kid's pants up. You don't see that tense, aggressive nature. But it's when the crowd starts converging and screaming, that's when the gorilla starts standing over in the very tense, aggressive, I want to intimidate them. And that's when he starts grabbing the boy, running back and forth, and doing an intimidation display with the boy as a tool. So one expert here is saying that no, this is not a protective, this is I'm freaked out by the crowd.
Now, she also goes on to comment, this Amanda girl who made this post, she goes on to comment that the gorillas, as a species, these lowland gorillas, are generally considered gentle giants and are not necessarily what we would call child killers. And we've seen this in the past with interactions between children and these gorillas. I'll go on to talk about that here in a bit. So we definitely have one opinion from a zookeeper that kind of states that the gorilla was doing more of an intimidation display as a result of what the crowd was doing, which is essentially freaking the gorilla out by their own responses.
Yes, an intimidation display, but aggressive and very life-threatening to the child, such a display.
Now, if we look at a primatologist, okay, a guy who has done this kind of research essentially for about 40 years.
So again,
you know,
a little
publishing.
step above just a zoologist.
Yeah. So we compared 2.5 years of working with gorillas in a zoo, which is great. That definitely helps you learn their behaviors and common actions and reasons for their actions. But then we compare that to 40 years of interacting with primates, publishing articles, publishing books, things of that nature, and we see that this guy, Franz de Waal, who is a professor here in the U.S., he actually has done a lot of work with these kinds of things. And so we're trying to see what his opinions on this topic are. Just because he's actually been doing this for a much longer time. In fact, a longer time than the zookeeper that we just mentioned has been alive. As such, he kind of goes on to discuss how gorillas display a variety of different behaviors. And in this particular instance, he feels that the gorilla displayed a combination of protective behaviors as well as a bit of confusion. And just from me watching it, I could see that.
The confusion was very, very evident.
Yeah.
Because people say the gorilla was dragging the kid for 10 minutes. No, not a full continuous dragging of 10 minutes.
Right.
The gorilla stood over the child. Then he would run across the side maybe once or twice. And then he would stop again and stand over the child. And then he would do it again. He did this dance for 10 minutes. But it was not a continuous thrashing and dragging. There was very, very obvious confusion.
Yeah. And if you watch the video, he looks right at the camera.
Yeah.
Okay, which tells you that he is responding to what's going on right there in that general vicinity.
He knows what's happening.
Okay, so he was getting freaked out, and this professor realizes that. He also goes on to say that gorillas aren't dangerous predators. Okay, predator is a very special term that we use to describe things that like to eat us. Right? Gorillas are not predators of humans. Okay, gorillas are vegetarians. As such, they really don't consider children to be prey, even if they are much smaller than themselves. So, we aren't looking at them as being something that wants to lock onto us as meaty food items. We're also looking at a situation where gorillas aren't predatory in how they select their targets, which is to say that they don't select moving targets like a big cat would. Okay, if you run in a lion enclosure,
you're screwed.
You're in big trouble. So
you're a laser pointer, little red dot on the ground. Ooh,
right. And we know that just by having household cats, they have many of the same behaviors, to where they love to lock onto moving targets. But he actually goes into detail with some of these previous cases of toddlers falling into lowland gorilla enclosures, and seeing that the outcomes were either neutral or very positive, to where the gorilla actually helped the child exit the enclosure very peaceably. And so we start to see, well, that's kind of interesting, because in this situation, he's saying, well, the gorilla was protective. So that kind of leans in the direction of the past experience with these gorillas and with toddlers in the same situation, where the gorillas have been either protective or have at least not harmed directly the child.
There was one case that happened in England where he was a little bit older. He wasn't 4. I think he was like 6 or 7.
Yeah, he was a little older.
He fell into a English zoo enclosure for the gorillas, and he was actually unconscious for a time. Very short amount of time, but when he came to, the gorilla was right there, and he started crying, and he was pretty loud wails, and it freaked the gorilla out. He went the other way.
Yeah.
But immediately they came in, they got the kid, and they went out. Nothing died, but just the gorilla doesn't want to say, oh my gosh, he's screaming, I'm intimidated. He kind of went the other way. That's a very foreign noise to them. They don't like that.
Yeah. And so what we see is, we see kind of a similar situation happening here, where it didn't seem to be the gorilla trying to harm the child. And it's entirely possible, and even this professor kind of mentions this, is that had the crowd been calmed down and kind of removed from the situation to allow that gorilla to calm down, because he was basically freaking out and reacting to the crowd.
Yeah.
Had we done that, we would have been able to avoid this whole situation entirely. Having to avoid killing the gorilla, because that hasn't had to be done in the past anyway. So why did we do it this time?
Yeah. A confused gorilla is one that is
Right.
afraid, hence the intimidation dance.
And that's the thing. Right.
Yeah.
And so we start to see, well, we didn't resort to the tranquilizer darts because that may have further agitated him, but we also could have just removed the cause of the agitation in the first place, and de-escalated the situation. Because that's what you see a lot of times even when we're involving with human types of situations, where we're dealing with criminals or hostage situations. You want to de-escalate the situation at the source. And in this case, the source was the crowd. And you can hear in the videos the crowd screaming and yelling, and the gorilla directly looking at the crowd because he's interacting with the crowd. And as you see in the video, he's taking the child further and further from the crowd
Away to hide.
try to protect it. And as he's standing over the child, that's indicating that he is trying to protect that child. Because like we said, if he wanted that child dead, boom, one hit, it would have done it.
So overall, looking at two experts, one working directly with gorillas in captivity, and one who makes his whole life the study of gorillas and different primates, we're seeing that it's very clear that the gorilla did make some protective gestures. For a time, gorilla wanted to protect the child, but the response of the crowd, it freaked him out. He was afraid. He started using the child to show intimidation, and then he went back to protecting. He was very confused. I think his initial gesture is to protect, and then fear and confusion made him be intimidating so he could still protect the child. So people who want to sit here and say, oh, he was dragging the child, that's not protecting. Yes, it's an element of protection. If he wants to intimidate the crowd to protect the child, they're connected. They're separate, but they are connected in a way. So was this necessary? Was shooting the gorilla necessary? We've looked at the facts. We've looked at experts. We've seen the video footage. We've talked about what exactly happened. And we didn't quite go into detail about tranquilizers. Now, just a little quick note about that. It's really hard to find information about tranquilizers. Just trying to do a Google search to find accurate, not biased information. The truth is, you're taking down an animal that size. The higher the dosage, the quicker the animals fall. But you do teeter on that line. A high dosage, it can kill the animal. And often, you tranquilize an animal, and they actually go up and they give the animal an antidote because they don't want the animal to sleep. The longer an animal is under the influence of a tranquilizer, the more likely they are to develop health problems or slip into a potential coma. A lot of bad things can happen the longer they sleep. So they pretty much say low dosage, more of a sedation, a little bit more. They actually kind of clonk out, fall asleep. And then you have something extreme where you're trying to take the animal down and maybe administer an antidote immediately. And if you're taking an animal this size, yes, it does take probably around 10 minutes for a tranquilizer to actually take effect. Anything to make the tranquilizer more effective, that's when you're risking killing the gorilla. So that's what we're looking at, tranquilizer. Yes, it would take more than just several minutes, about 10 minutes for a tranq to work. So was this necessary? Looking at all of the information, I think the biggest problem is mom needs to supervise child. Number one, have a leash. Do something, pay extra attention. That is number one issue. It's why this happened. Should the mother face charges? Personally, I don't think so. I think the extent of charges that should be faced is maybe this woman being banned from the zoo. And even then, I would think that'd be a little much, but I think that'd be crazy. And so, problem number one. Two, the zoo needed to get the crowd away, and that would have made tranquilizer less likely. And then, on top of that, with the way it played out, I personally think that had they pulled the crowd out, I think a tranquilizer would have been more realistic, but they didn't, and things escalated to that point. And the question was, do you want to risk 10 minutes for a tranquilizer to work and 10 minutes of a child's life in your hands and chance, or do you shoot the gorilla? That is all that's in question right now. You can forget all the other crap. What actually happened is Kid was in a dangerous situation, and it could have gotten worse because the crowd was uncontrolled. That's what happened. There's a lot of ifs, ands, or but that's facts. That's all we care about.
Yep. So, as such, we'll go ahead and close out the episode. My name is Chris. This is my wife Uriah. And if you're interested in finding any of our other Based on Facts episodes, you can simply do a search on Facebook or YouTube for our channels to find some of our previous episodes. So thank you for tuning in, and have a great day.
A gorilla great day.